system transports cells to other areas of the body, endometrial cells to the other area of the body. So look, the bottom line is an alien isn't coming out from outer space and taking endometrial cells and taking those endometrial cells and placing them around the body. So there has to be a way they have to get around the body. There has to be a way. You know, an alien's not coming out of the sky and doing it. So, all right, we won't be talking that silly. So that's another theory too. And then there's another theory, the immune system disorder, which it's always going to go here and lead here, like meaning in the sense that this is the theory it's always going to land on, which is your immune system is attacking itself. Your body's distorted. You know what I mean? Because your body's twisted. It's attacking itself. It doesn't know what's right or what's wrong. Doesn't know what's up and down. This is the autoimmune theory. So it always goes in there. The body can't recognize and destroy the endometrial cells. So what's happening is these endometrial cells are getting on the outside of the uterus and they're finding their way into the pelvic cavity, and your body isn't recognizing them to destroy them. So they're just growing. It's kind of a little bit of a backwards rendition of autoimmune disease, but it's still in the same category where they're putting it, where your body's creating this. It's an immune system disorder, and your body can't recognize and destroy these endometrial cells. So that's where that one is. That's a theory too, all on its own. So I'm just running through some of the theories of modern medicine. But no matter how you slice the pie, no matter how you slice the cake or whatever you want to do, the bottom line is, medical science researchers saying we don't know how these cells get on the outside of the uterus. We don't know how they get there. They just do. They just do. That's the bottom line. So there's a couple of things that happen with. There's a couple of things. So let's go into the nitty gritty. Let's go into the deep stuff. Let's go into the real McCoy. Let's go into the real deal. Okay, of what's really going on and what's happening with endometriosis. We have a couple of things. One thing you have to understand here is endometrial cells have a life to them like no other. They have a life to them like no other. So we're dealing with the uterus here. We're dealing with the maker of life. Someone might argue and say, well, the egg is the maker of life before it even gets into the uterus, so you're wrong, Anthony. Someone else might say, well, the ovaries are the maker of life, so you're definitely wrong there. Well, no. The uterus, you can have all the eggs you want, and you can have your ovaries can be perfect, but the uterus has to keep life sustained for those 9 months. The uterus has to keep life sustained. So precious life, a living being, has to be sustained and protected and in good standing, more than good standing, protected, a little angelic being inside the uterus and a little baby. And so the uterus is a really fierce protector of life. That's what the uterus is. Endometrial cells are programmed with information, tremendous amounts of information. I mean, honestly, the information in one endometrial cell would probably explode a computer's database, would just overwhelm it, override it. I'm not computer savvy or anything. I'm not a big tech savvy person, but you get the drift of what I'm trying to say. The information, literally, if it was somehow decoded or somehow downloaded from one endometrial cell, it would have centuries, but you get the drift of what I'm trying to say. The information, literally, if it was somehow decoded or somehow downloaded from one endometrial cell, it would have centuries and centuries and centuries and thousands of years of information within it from the human species alone, and how life sustains itself and how life is protected within the uterus and everything around it. So the will for an endometrial cell to survive is great. It's great. And so that's something just to realize and just consider of what you're dealing with. Like, if you don't know what you're dealing with, then you're going to underestimate it. You don't know what you're dealing with, and you're going to call the wrong shots. If you don't know what you're dealing with, then you're not going to know what causes what and what disease, what illness. If you don't know what you're dealing with, like they don't know what they're still dealing with Lyme disease out there. I'm sorry to say that. If that confuses you, get my Lyme chapter from book 1. Just read it. If you don't know what you're dealing with, that's not good. That's where we go wrong right at the beginning if we don't even know what we're dealing with. If we don't understand the uterus and we don't know what we're dealing with to a degree with the uterus or any kind of cells, uterus-based or any kind of endometrial cells, if we don't know what we're dealing with here, and I'm saying that over and over again because it's that intense, then we don't know where we really stand. We don't know where we really stand. We don't. What happens is a uterus has to be clean. It has to be clean. What does that mean? You have your menstrual cycle, it's cleaning itself out. Bacteria clean from heavy metals, clean from poisons and toxins, clean from troublemakers, clean from all of those troublemakers. Clean. What does that mean? Why am I saying that over and over again? I'm saying it over and over again because what happens is that the endometrial cells are used to leave the uterus with a poison or a toxin in it to keep the uterus clean. That's what's going on. How do they get out of the uterus? We'll talk about that in a couple of seconds. But the point is that they're carrying something. The uterus does not want those cells inside the uterus. That's how this is done. So those endometrial cells, if they were studied with the right kind of science, we're just not there yet. We don't have science that can study much of anything. We're playing around with genes, and that's all fun and dandy, and it's all because they're interested in cloning. So they want all this money going into genes, and then they'll tell you that genes are the reason why we're sick. So more money gets dumped into it, more money, more investing gets dumped into it. But meanwhile, they're not working on any of that. What they're working on is just more cloning. They want to clone monkeys. They want to clone humans. They want to clone. It's just cloning. It's a sick cloning game that's being built without anybody's permission or anybody knowing about it. Just so you know, that's why they throw the gene theory at us all the time. It's so we have everybody becomes a pawn, meaning experts become a pawn, wealthy people become a pawn, and they dump more and more money into the factory of genes so they can say they're working on our mysteries of healing us in chronic illness, but what they're really doing is they're just sitting there privately working on trying to clone and do other sinister things and devious things. But science and research really doesn't do anything about anything else. So when you have these endometrial cells, they're literally packed with not only information and a will to survive and a will to live, but they're harboring a poison and a toxin. They've been kicked out of the uterus. They've been kicked out. And they've been kicked out. They're not just kicked out during menstrual cycles. That's not enough. They get kicked out in between it all. They get pushed out. Endometrial cells get pushed out through the lining of the uterus, a process that no one knows. Now, what I liked about was one of the theories that they have, which I actually thought it was a cool theory. It was when the fallopian tubes, it went backwards. It was the retrograde menstrual cycle where your cycle, the blood actually pushed up with cells in it backwards up through the fallopian tube and out into the pelvic cavity. I did like that theory a lot. It was not quite accurate. Another miraculous theory, but it's not quite accurate. or record it or understand it, because unless you live inside of a human being's body, unless you live inside of a woman's body and live in there, which you can't, you'll never see the process. The process is just impossible to understand. But cells are pushed through the walls of the uterus. These are cells that have poison in them, that have to leave the uterus. A lot of women have tremendous amounts of heavy metals in them. Lots of mercury, lead, aluminum, arsenic, cadmium, nickel, barium. I don't know, more than that, copper, and even more than that. And these toxic heavy metals are just one thing, but that's not why these cells are being pushed through the uterus and out the other way. These cells are being pushed through because they're loaded with pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, larvicides. Larvicide. Dangerous chemicals that are in colognes and perfumes and hairspray. And all the dangerous chemicals that are actually within these. They're loaded with dangerous chemicals that are in colognes and perfumes and hairspray. These cells get loaded with everything that we not only inherit through our family line, like DDT. So we inherit DDT. We get that from our family line, not only mercury from our family line, not only those poisons, we get a lot more poisons than that and then there's poisons in foods, and then there's pharmaceuticals too, and all the pharmaceutical poison that we inherit, that we have in our system from our forefathers, foremothers, and then we already have them, and then we bring in more pharmaceutical poison, and then on top of that, I mean, it's endless, all the way to air fresheners. It's everything. It's poison from every avenue. Solvents, I mean, that are on everything that we don't even know about. Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, especially fungicides, are on everything. They're on clothing. Fungicides are all over new clothing, just all over new clothing. And they find their way. These poisons get in deep into the uterus, and the uterus excrete poisons using endometrial cells. And the reason why science and research is never going to tap into this, ever touch upon it, ever do anything about it, is because it will then showcase all the poisons. They'll have to do profiles on these poisons. They'll have to take an endometrial and all the poisons. They'll have to do profiles on these poisons. They'll have to take an endometrial cell and they'll have to do a profile on the poison. And they're going to find everything in there. They're going to find every chemical from every chemical factory that should be shut down. It literally should be shut down. Trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in lawsuits. Hundreds of trillions of dollars in lawsuits. Because these chemicals that are in women's bodies, I mean, just imagine where that would go if that was all discovered and all profiled, and science and research decided to make a database of what's in every cell. They won't. They don't want to know any of that. No one wants to know anything. No one wants to know anything in the industries. So the uterus sends these cells out, pushes these cells out. And these cells have a life force. And they're really, really tiny. These cells start out so tiny, but they harbor not only tremendous amounts of information of life force and needing to grow and needing to live, because they get that information automatically from years and years of years and years of being in human history, of a woman's human being in history and life force to create life, but from the uterus, and then to harbor that information and have that information to grow and to become is part of it, but they do need to be triggered in order